Howdy y'all. In this video, we're going to do just a short overview of some of the readings in this section on assisted reproduction, which is part of Ethical Issues in Modern Medicine, Part 5, Section 2. All right, so we're going to start with John Robertson's piece, which is the presumptive primacy of procreative liberty. And I just want to go through some of the distinctions that Robertson makes and some of the ethical concerns that he acknowledges. So Robertson himself, as is evident in the title of the piece, believes that these moral concerns can be sort of overcome, but there's sort of a lot to sort of unpack here, and I think he does a helpful job of making certain distinctions. So with regards just to the medical technology that helps with assisted reproduction, I think he makes an interesting distinction between sort of three areas in which um, procreation sort of have usually been sort of tied together without medical technology, but because of medical technology, these things have sort of come apart. So I'm going to start then with this distinction between sort of the genetic transfer, the gestation of the fetus, and then the rearing of the child. So as I mentioned, typically, or at least historically, those things have gone together, sort of hand in hand. That the people providing the genetic material and gestating the child and rearing the child are were thought to be sort of provided by the same person. Of course, the rearing one can be separated without sort of medical technology. There are non-biological parents. Adoption is an example of where the rearing is distinct from genetic transfer and gestation. Um, so that's nothing new, but with the genetic transfer and gestation, there's some issues that we want to think about. So starting with just the provision of the genetic material, so there are a lot of uh, reproductive assistance that involve the partner's reproductive material. That is to say, that they aren't enlisting the help from a third party. So with those issues, I mean, you still have things like in vitro fertilization, and you still have um, the idea of bringing embryos into existence that will be sort of unused or discarded, but nevertheless, the material is provided by the partners. And then in many cases, the gestation continues along that way as well. Um, but there is this sort of issue with genetic transfer where some or both of the genetic components are not provided by the person doing the gestation, and not going to be reared or not involved in the rearing of the child. And then it has to do with egg donation and sperm donation. So there's some issues here as are discussed in sort of later reading, mostly around egg donation, right? Egg donation is more of a process. There's more risks involved. It's just a timelier exercise, whereas sperm donation is a relatively easy thing, um, and less of a moral issue. But anyway, as I mentioned, with both partners providing the material and third parties providing the material, there will be this issue of unused embryos. And this is something that we don't go into a lot of detail in this reading, in part because it's sort of been covered by the abortion debate. So whether or not an embryo is a person or has sort of all the rights of a fully formed human being are issues that were discussed previously. So for the most part, and they're sort of left out of this discussion in these readings. It is taken up a little bit in the reading from the Vatican protocols, but in terms of the philosophers making the various arguments, you don't see too much of it. So it's not that it isn't an issue, it's just that we're going to sort of focus on some different issues. Okay, so the other thing that we have to think about in terms of medical technologies allowing us to make these kinds of distinctions is the distinction between the genetic material that's being provided and the person doing the gestation of the fetus. So this is primarily a discussion of surrogacy. So um, surrogacy or contract pregnancy would be a situation where the people who will be rearing the child and providing the genetic material are not the people who are gestating the child. So this would be a situation of infertile couples who are unable to bring a child to term. Um, Naturally would potentially enlist a surrogate. So again, sort of all these sorts of issues come with their own sort of distinct challenges and distinct technologies involved in their use. And at some level, there's always going to be sort of a moral unease with these things for those people who believe these things to be unnatural. So insofar as this is all artificial, it's going to, for some people, be sort of morally problematic. But Robertson and others don't really sort of deal with the naturalness objection. So here are some of the moral concerns that Robertson sort of mentions. So the one set of these moral concerns are sort of irrelevant to the technology involved. So there are going to be some concerns about bringing a child into a world that's overpopulated, or that the parents may be sort of psychologically or unfit for some other reason. They may be poor and unable to care for the child, and there's just going to be sort of issues of uh, being sort of the non-biologically sort of related to the progeny, at least in some cases, not in all cases, obviously. But those are concerns that aren't sort of unique to assisted reproductive technologies, that they're going to be the same sorts of issues for people who produce children outside of such technologies, and thus are really not going to be sort of focused on with any of the discussions here. So moving on to things that are sort of more relevant to these technologies would be sort of the things in this middle column. So some of the things that Robertson mentions as uh, sort of relevant to this issue of in vitro fertilization or surrogacy or whatever have you are going to be things like the reduction in demand for adoption. So they're going to be concerned that um, less adoptable children who already exist are going to have fewer opportunities for adoption as a result of these fertility treatments. Um, there is a concern, which is the primary concern of Steinbach's piece, which we'll talk about here in a second, which has to do with sort of exploitation of donors, especially sort of egg donors, so women who are donating their eggs for the process of in vitro fertilization could potentially be exploited. Connected to that is the objectification of women, um, and concerns for the undermining of the nuclear family, or the proper role of traditional family. So I actually kind of have uh, those two ideas come up in two categories here. There's the uh, relevant societal harms, but also the deontological concerns. Um, so the deontological concerns are, when we say deontological, we mean sort of the moral rules. And one of the things that sort of distinguish sort of the deontological concerns from the potentially sort of relevant societal harms is that they're more uh, aspects of sort of particular sort of moral outlooks or religious outlooks. So they're sort of narrowly sort of embraced concerns that aren't going to really do a lot of work on people who don't sort of share that particular sort of moral or religious outlook. And the reason that we sort of bring this up, or that this should be sort of distinguished, is that there is going to be this distinction, as we had with abortion, between sort of the morality of something and the legality of something. So the types of concerns that you might have at this level may not be the sorts of concerns that you can impose on other people in any sort of legitimate legal framework, or at least a legitimate legal framework where you accept a plurality of outlooks and conceptions of the good. But anyway, the deontological concerns, which are kind of represented by the Vatican piece in this reading, are things like the sanctity of marriage, the proper role of women and reproduction, the proper role of a traditional family, and the flavor of this is just kind of that these technologies allow for that stuff to sort of come apart. So if, for instance, somebody outside of the marriage is providing genetic material for the creation of a child, there's potentially sort of concern that that sort of undermines the sanctity of marriage, or undermines the proper role of women, or what have you. And again, those concerns may sort of be legitimate, but they are sort of narrow and focused, right? They're not going to be something that we could rely upon in terms of coercion from the state. So again, just making a distinction between sort of the legality of something and the morality of something. And this is something that we're going to see kind of come up in a couple different ways, especially with the Murray piece and the Steinbach piece. So maybe we should just move on to that. So Murray is sort of critical of this idea of procreative liberty, and one of at the beginning of his short piece, he talks about how there's sort of three defects of this sort of procreative liberty sort of outlook, which I take it to be that the procreative liberty stuff is not a comprehensive moral guide. That at best, what it does is provides a sort of a legal framework for sort of what sorts of things the state can and cannot impose on people. And so from sort of a moral point of view, sort of from a complete sort of moral point of view, a personal decision point of view, a moral, a judgment of somebody's actions, that, just focusing on control and choice, which would be sort of procreative liberty, is not going to be sort of sufficient to kind of answer all the moral questions that we might want to be answered. So beyond that, sort of he mentions another defect is that there isn't really sort of a robust discussion of the interests of the child, other than maybe asking whether or not the child would be better off not being born. And furthermore, there is this what he sees as a failure to acknowledge the central values of family life. And again, just sort of saying that control and choice are not the only or even the most important values when it comes to making a family and deciding what I don't know what sorts of purposes a family uh, achieves. So the the way that he tries to kind of make this sort of clear at the end of his piece is with this sort of Nash family example. And so the Nash family, they have this child with Fanconi anemia, and Fanconi anemia leads to uh, a bunch of sort of nasty things, one being the loss of bone marrow production, and the other being leukemia. And the only way to sort of keep it at bay is through healthy blood transfusions. And so he imagines this kind of situation where, through the use of reproductive technologies, the Nash family could get a new sibling, one in which would, you know, apart from being sort of a new sibling, would not suffer from Fanconi anemia, which is very life-threatening, and furthermore could sort of potentially provide healthy blood for transfusion to the younger sibling. And uh, what Murray tries to do is say, well, there could be a sort of good and bad versions of this, right? There could be decisions made by the Nash family such that it would be sort of morally appropriate for them to proceed with such a plan that they will love the new child just as much as the old one, and the new child isn't just sort of a means to an end. Um, but on the other hand, it's potentially the case that they're doing things for the wrong reasons, and they only sort of see uh, this new child as being sort of a bearer or a lifeboat for the previous child. And so he thinks, well, that second situation is bad from a moral perspective, that you shouldn't sort of do that. And his concern is that sort of the procreative liberty sort of idea doesn't distinguish between sort of good and bad versions of this, of the Nash family decision, right? Because it only focuses on the choice and control, and doesn't sort of focus on, how this is going to fit within sort of the family life and so on and so forth. So again, just kind of makes clear, I guess, that it's not a comprehensive moral guide, and that in order to really sort of think about the morality of these things, you have to consider stuff beyond the sort of procreative liberty. So again, as sort of a moral theory, that's probably true. It's not clear how that would affect sort of the legal standing of these kinds of decisions, uh, but certainly something worth considering. The other thing to note, though, is it's hard to see why this is relevant to or only to reproductive technologies. So it may be the case that with the Nash family, this option is only sort of available to them because of reproductive technologies, but it's also entirely possible that this could come through sort of natural means. So they may know that the likelihood of another child having Fanconi anemia is very low, and they decide to sort of go ahead with it for the precise reason of their unsavory desires to just focus on the first child. So it doesn't seem that it has to be sort of accompanied by some reproductive technology, and as such, it's unclear how that would sort of affect our evaluation of reproductive technology. So again, things that could be sort of conceded to Murray, and then things that are sort of left over for sort of questioning. Okay, so we're going to end with Bonnie Steinbach's focus on egg donation and in particular uh, the issue of payment for egg donation. So whether or not um, egg donors should be or excuse me, should be paid, or sort of what sorts of moral issues come along with the payment of egg donors. So what we're going to do here is just briefly go through sort of the three sort of major concerns that are mentioned in the piece and a few of her responses to those concerns. So more or less, her sort of general view is that payment isn't sort of necessarily morally problematic, that there may be sort of situations in which payment is okay, and furthermore, there may be situations in which a purely voluntary system are even more morally problematic. So anyway, she starts with commodification. So the concern is that, here are people sort of selling their body parts, and potentially this is, marketing or commodifying something that shouldn't be marketed or commodified. And she doesn't seem to have too much of a problem with this. She mentions Ruth Macklin, has a quote from Ruth Macklin here, in which she says, "Every service in our economy is sold. Academics sell their minds, athletes sell their bodies. If a pretty woman sells her appearance and skill for television, why should a fecund woman be denied the ability to sell her eggs? Why is one more demeaning than the other?" And the assumption, I'm assuming, is that it's not, that there isn't anything sort of necessarily more problematic of one than the other. And then she also gives an example from fiction. In Little Women, there's a scene where Jo sells her hair and is thought to be sort of unselfish and noble as a result. So again, the selling of body parts isn't thought to be sort of necessarily a morally problematic thing. So at least at that sort of essential level, we might not have a concern. Moving on to some other concerns, there is, I think, the concerns that she takes sort of most seriously are the concerns about sort of exploitation by, lording over large sums of money. You could, potentially exploit or coerce people who are badly off. That is something that she agrees is a possibility, but she also responds that, you could also have exploitation of altruistic individuals by offering no sums of money at all. So there is, in her mind, the possibility of offering too much, but we also have to sort of consider the possibility of offering too little. Furthermore, there's this concern that the monetary incentive will cause donors to sort of ignore risks and to not be sort of fully informed in their consent. And again, the concern is that this is a concern. This is a potentially exploitive situation. But to bear in mind that the risk may actually be greater under a voluntary system than under sort of a commercial one. So it may be that by paying people, you have more people to give money to do the proper screening and education and so on and so forth. So this middle section is considered to be, the most kind of worrisome and the most sort of worthy of consideration. But she does kind of end with kind of responding to sort of Murray's concern about, the value of families and the worry that commodification and exploitation sort of undermines potentially the fundamental sort of value of families. And her response, and I just have it in quotes here, is that one can agree with Murray's view that thinking of children as property and a family life is essentially a series of commercial transactions is a grievous distortion. But it is unclear what this has to do with paying gamete donors. Eggs are not children, and buying eggs or even embryos is not buying children. So again, this kind of gets to this idea of how much of these sorts of concerns are sort of genuinely concerns about the technology being provided, or more just sort of general concerns, moral concerns about how we ought to sort of view families. So if you can enter into an arrangement with somebody and not lose sight of the value of families, and not have your family degenerate into thinking of children as property, then regardless of the technology that you use to bring the child about, um, you will, be safe from the moral concerns that individuals like Murray present. All right, so anyway, that's just a brief overview of sort of the main sort of threads of thinking here. We'll talk more about this in our session together, but hopefully this clears a few things up.